Great, Shirley, you're up. Thank you, Art. Thank you, Shirley. That was I love that presentation. That was fascinating. I love writing books for a lot of reasons. One of them is, you get a chance to meet people and interview people. And for this book, I interviewed, for instance, John Dingell, former Congressman Dingell, or soon to be former Congressman Dingell, who was a 15-year-old page on the floor of the House of Representatives on December 8, 1941. His father was a member of Congress. He was a page, and we interviewed him about witnessing real history in the making, the Day of Infamy speech. Also interviewed a fellow by the name of Jay Dawley, 95 years old, West Point class of 1939, was stationed at the Army base on Oahu, and on December 7, 1941, was in his bunk, heard explosions, ran outside in his skivvies, was told by his CO to start shooting anything he saw in the sky. And he started doing that, right there in the field in his underwear. So you meet all sorts of wonderful people at the. One of the things for December 41 last year, I went on the Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and I wasn't all that familiar with the Daily Show. I think there's a generational divide. We have 4 children, and my kids, our kids, know all about it. I wasn't all that familiar with it, and I think there's some kind of divide somewhere. You might call it a bright red line or something like that. But anyway, so we went up to New York to do the pre-interview, and then do the show that night. And I was in the hotel room, and the producer calls, and she said, asked me all sorts of questions. And then she says, I don't even know why I bother asking, because John was going to ask me the questions that he wants to ask anyway. And before, so we make up the arrangements, where we're supposed to be, and all the other stuff. And finally, as we're wrapping up the conversation, I said to the woman, I said, Jennifer, I don't know how to tell you this, but I think my kids are more excited about me going on with Jon Stewart on the Daily Show than I am. And this long pause, and she said, Mr. Shirley, we heard that a lot from men your age. So that's one of the funnier sides. Is why this book? Because I have now written 4 books on Ronald Reagan. 2 have been published. One is with the publisher being edited now, and I'm finishing up a 4th. But I wanted to take a little bit. I've been immersed in Reagan and Reaganism and his presidency and all those other things for many, many years. But I always was interested in this period of time from the civilian standpoint. And that's what I tried to write from. Gordon Craig wrote the definitive book on Pearl Harbor, and Dawn We Slept. Nothing will ever surpass it. That was the greatest book ever written on December 7, 1941. But I discovered that there were very few books written from the perspective of civilian life and how it radically changed between December 7th and December 31st, and then throughout the rest of the war. And as I tell people, is that I grew up in an Andy Hardy movie in upstate New York. Is that my grandfather was a very prominent businessman like Judge Stone, and we used to get together for Sunday dinner. When I was a child, after church, we would either be at my mother's house or my grandmother's or an aunt's house, and everybody, all the men were in suits and ties, and the women were in dresses, and be a big ham or turkey or whatever, and lace, tablecloth, and linen handkerchiefs, and all those other things. And invariably, the conversation would turn to the war. And they didn't say World War II, but it was always the war. And that was the point of reference for everything. And I'd sit there and I'd listen to my grandparents and listen to aunts and uncles and my parents talk about it. And you hear my grandfather say, well, I bought that DeSoto before the war, but I didn't sell it until after the war. And they would talk about oleomargarine and mixing in the dye and how awful it tasted, and fake coffee and all those other things. The other thing too is that my family was, like most, probably everybody here, was very much immersed in what was called the war effort. If you were not in uniform, everybody still served in one way, shape, or form. At least most Americans did. My grandfather at the time was 43, 44 years old. He tried to enlist 3 times. And he was turned down 3 times, and he was told 3 times by the draft board, they said, Ellsworth, we're not that desperate. You're blind as a bat, you have dependents, we'll call you if we need you. So he became a civil defense block captain. Both my grandmothers were Rose of the Riveters. One tested machine guns, the other was a bomb inspector. My father was a Boy Scout at the time, and the government used the Boy Scouts to distribute promotional posters, you know, in churches and grocery stores and bars. There were bars, there were posters that the government was producing that says, if you're going to drink, shut up. That would go up in bars because, you know, loose lips sink ships. My mother had victory gardens, and they both did scrap drives. So everybody in my family, including my father's oldest brother, you may have seen his picture up here, he made the ultimate sacrifice. He was he signed up, tried to sign up before he was allowed to, and they said no, and as soon as you were old enough at a certain age, you'd get your parents' permission to go in early, which he did. Ellsworth Abbott Barney, his nickname was Barney, Shirley, enlisted in the Navy and was a radio operator on a TBF-1 Avenger off the Essex, and was shot down and killed on his 21st birthday in 1945. And so I always grew up with all these stories about the home life. The America of World War II and the America that came out of World War II is radically and tremendously different from the America before World War II. And by the way, it wasn't even called World War II for a long time after December 7th, 1941, after December 11th, 1941. It was still called, you know, the emergency, the national emergency, or the war. Obviously, World War I wasn't called World War I because nobody thought there was going to be another war. That was the war to end all wars, supposedly, which actually gave rise to new threatening powers, which then led to, in some ways, to World War II. But, you know, just to illustrate the difference, you know, is that you come out of World War II, and the President of the United States now, from Franklin Roosevelt to Barack Obama and every president in between, has been referred to as the most powerful man in the world, the leader of the free world. Well, that wasn't the fixation of a United States president before that, is that there were many powerful men in the world, and queens, you know, in Russia, czars. England was the navy that ruled the waves. Is that we were not the superpower, and as a matter of fact, we're very, very isolationist coming out of World War I. So the World War II changes everything. Is that you cannot put your finger on any part of American culture, society, science, technology, politics. Everything changes. We come out of World War I, we become isolationists. We reject the League of Nations. We tighten our immigration policies. We passed the Neutrality Acts of the 1930s, which actually prohibited American troops from leaving U.S. soil, leaving North America. And that was the world in which we operated. So then you have rise, of course, to the America First movement after the Nazi invasion of Poland in September of 1939, and which, of course, we didn't respond to. Is that December 7th and 8th and thereafter is the one time in the history of the United States. You know, we like to kid ourselves that we're you know, united as a citizenry. We've never been united. We've always been divided. During the American Revolution, there was a lot of Tory sympathizers in the United States. Benjamin Franklin's son was imprisoned as a Tory sympathizer during the Revolutionary War. We were not united during the War of 1812. The Civil War was about the divisions in this country. The Spanish-American War again. Even our entry into World War II, Congress debated it for many, many days, and even then, after Wilson's request for a declaration of war, is that 50 members of the House and a handful of United States senators voted against our entry into World War I. And obviously, Afghanistan and Iraq, Vietnam, all these wars that we've been in since World War II, Korea, we have not been necessarily united as a country. We're always united in support of the military, but not united in support of the politicians or the policy. The one time in the history of the United States where we are complete unanimity is the afternoon of December 7th, 1941. There's nobody in America who is against going to war with the Empire of Japan. Nobody. Except for, of course, as some of you know, Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin from Montana, and I've always thought that that a book needs to be done about her, because she was first woman elected to Congress. She was in Congress in 1917, was one of the 50 who voted against entry into war, was immediately voted out of Congress. She was in the wilderness for many, many years and then was reelected in 1940, and then in 1941, she's again confronted with a war vote. And she said at the time, she says, I cannot send young boys to go fight in a war that I can't go fight in myself. She was extremely thoughtful, and of course, it cost her political career because she was out of politics by 1942. She didn't seek re-election in 1942. But she's the only one. Everybody in the United States Senate, everybody in the United States House, everybody across America, you didn't find anybody who said we should not retaliate against the Empire of Japan. Now, some people try to, but this is not our entry into World War II because the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and also Wake Island, the Philippines, the Malay Peninsula, a number of other U.S. and British military installations and civilian installations. It was a massive strike in the Central and Western Pacific. But even then, is that there's no will in this country whatsoever to get into the European war. After, as I mentioned, after World War I, we became isolationists. After World War I, there was a saying going around this country that all we got was death and debt and Georgia and Cohen. And there was a real belief on the part of the American people that it wasn't worth it. That we loaned the European powers a lot of money, which was never repaid. A lot of American doughboys, as they were called at the time, died, maimed, whatever. Some came back, like Christy Matthewson, the great pitcher, was mustard gassed in Germany and came back and died prematurely. He was never the ball player he was afterward, and of course died, I believe, in his 40s. Which of course led to the banning of chemical weapons and the Geneva Conventions. But that was the country we were operating in. Is the mentioned we rejected the League of Nations. I want to read from a memo that was sent to the White House on December 4th, 1941, and then explain it, put it in context. Now, there's been, we all asked about this question about the linkage between, the attack on Pearl Harbor, and did Franklin Roosevelt know about it, and did he allow it to happen? I think in Roosevelt's defense, I think it's utterly completely nonsense. There's no doubt. I mean, the straws were in the wind. We had cracked a diplomatic code. They were sending, coded transmission to their embassies in Washington, and of course they had consulates around the United States, in New Orleans and San Francisco, wherever we had big naval bases or military operations. It seemed like it was a coincidence that they had consulates there in Boston and New York. And all of this was, they were gathering information on U.S. military, and we knew it. This was a memo that went to the White House. Now, and then I'll explain how we came by this. On December 4th, 1941, from the Office of Naval Intelligence, subject Japanese intelligence and propaganda in the United States during 1941. On page 2, it reads, the focal point of the Japanese espionage effort is the determination of the total strength of the United States. In anticipation of possible open conflict with this country, Japan is vigorously utilizing every available agency to secure military, naval, and commercial information, paying particular attention to the West Coast, the Panama Canal, and the territory of Hawaii. Now, this was a classified memo until the 1980s. My son, one of our sons, Andrew, was the principal researcher for me on December 1941. He uncovered this at Hyde Park. He'd been laying around there with a number of other documents that had been declassified in the 80s, but nobody paid any attention to it whatsoever. Now, the rest of the memo goes into extensive detail about Japanese military intentions, but we were thinking at the time is that they probably focused more on the Philippines, not necessarily on Hawaii. But this does put it a little bit closer to the notion that Washington could have done more to alert the Pacific commands that things possibly were going to change very quickly in the Pacific. But I reject the idea that Franklin Roosevelt did it because he wanted to help, he allowed it to happen because he wanted to help his friend Winston Churchill. First of all, the President of the United States is sworn to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. If it had been demonstrated that he knew about the attack on Pearl Harbor, he would have been impeached. He didn't know about it. The second thing is that I was making this point earlier, is that the Japanese attack is on December 7th. We declare war on December 8th, but it's not until December 11th that Germany and Italy stupidly and foolishly declare war on us, which means now we've got to respond, retaliate, and declare war on Germany and Italy on December 11th. But in that intervening time, in those intervening several days, there's nothing. There's no editorials, there's no congressional speeches, there's no letters to the editor, there's nothing coming from the White House to intimate any intention of ours whatsoever to get into the European war. As a matter of fact, we were also, my son was going through, Henry Stimson was at the time the Secretary of War. His papers are at Yale, and we were going through his papers there. We found a draft of Franklin Roosevelt's 500-word avowed Day of Infamy speech. It was a draft of it, and they had typed in a declaration of war, and they obviously discussed it, to declare war on Germany, Italy, and Japan, but a line had been drawn through Germany and Italy, and they just decided that on December 8th they were just going to declare war on Japan, because there was, even then, there was no political will in this country. So although Winston Churchill was reportedly, and he said in his own writings that he was jubilant about the attack because he knew it would eventually lead to America getting into the war, the European war, there was no will in this country to do so. I just got a few minutes left here, and then questions and answers. Is that 2 points I want to make? Is John Patrick Dickens, who was a friend of mine, a historian, was in many ways the unofficial historian of the American left in America in the 20th century. He wrote books on the labor movement, he wrote books on the women's movement, he wrote books on the environmental movement. But his last book was about Reagan, and that's how we crossed paths and became friends. It was called Ronald Reagan, Fate, Freedom, and the Making of History. In that book, he established a criteria for greatness, for great American presidents. And the greatness, and the baseline that he established was that, did they save or free many people? And so by his criteria, our 4 greatest presidents were Franklin Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, and Ronald Reagan, because they had saved or liberated many, many people. I don't think there's any doubt. If you look at the New Deal, you stand back and look at it, and Reagan always defended it, and I see what Roosevelt was trying to do, and trying to instill spirit in the American people and hope in the American people, and we had to try something. But there's no doubt that absent Franklin Roosevelt, absent Winston Churchill, that the world would be a much worse place today without them. Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, defeated the Empire of Japan and defeated Nazi Germany and Italy. As far as the attack itself, in 1967, Apollo 1, as many of us remember, burned up on the launch pad. And we had been on a pretty good roll for, with Shepard and the Glenn and then walking in space and the success of the Gemini program, and then we're going to the moon to fulfill Kennedy's commitment before the end of the decade. And it looks like everything's great, and Apollo 1 in a dress rehearsal in an unfueled rocket, and 3 astronauts burned to death. And the head of the NASA investigation at the time was Frank Borman, who himself was an astronaut. And he's hauled before a congressional committee that was chaired by Clinton Anderson, who was then a senator from New Mexico. And he says, how does this happen? How does this happen? And he used a phrase that's been used before in literature, but it's still applicable. He said, Senator, it was a failure of imagination. We simply couldn't conceive the idea that this series of bizarre events, that one would trigger the other, which would trigger the other, which would lead to these men's deaths. The same thing was happening on December 7, 1941. We simply didn't conceive. There were war games about it. We thought about it. The War Department, husband Kimmel, who was the admiral, who was one of the real victims, along with Walter Short, of the events of Pearl Harbor and how they were treated afterward. But they really didn't ever think that the Japanese could move 6 aircraft carriers over 4,000 miles, along with dozens of escort ships, over 500 airplanes, thousands of men, stop in mid-ocean to refuel and come in and attack Hawaii. And not only that, attack the Philippines, attack Midway, attack Wake Island, attack the Malay Peninsula, all these other places in a massive strike. Nobody thought that the Japanese had the industrial plan, that they had the war material, or that they even had the military or political will to do something like that. And so it was a series of events, but in an ironic sort of way. I mean, it was a terrible tragedy, a terrible event. It changes the country forever. In some ways, good, because we become internationalists, and I think there was some good things that being the case being made about that, and other things that are not so good are being made about that. But it does everything that, as I started out saying, is that everything that is different in America today, much, or if not most, can be traced to December 7th, 1941. Thank you.
The second question is for Craig. Craig, can you talk about MacArthur in December 41? What are you doing?
Yes, he was the commander of the Army garrison on the Philippines. MacArthur, I don't know anybody who doesn't have a strong opinion about Douglas MacArthur. And I remember growing up as a child, that my grandparents just utterly adored him, but I know that there were people who didn't feel that way about Douglas MacArthur. He is an interesting figure of history, because his installation was attacked on December 8th, 1941. He had 12 hours notice after the attack at Pearl Harbor, and yet did nothing. At Clark Field, there were American airplanes were aligned up wingtip to wingtip, even though he had advance notice. I don't know the reason why he wasn't court-martialed or driven out the way Kimmel and Short were. Husband Kimmel was the new admiral of the Navy fleet in the Hawaiian Islands, and was out of the Navy by just January of 1942, and lived his life, understandably, pretty bitter, because he took the blame. The politicians in Washington created, the Roosevelt administration quickly created a commission and asked the Congress not to investigate what happened at Pearl Harbor and how it happened, who's to blame, basically. And the Roosevelt administration had complete control of this Blue Ribbon Commission. And Roosevelt specifically asked the House and Senate not to initiate their own investigations, and they complied. And you know, is that in politics, when something goes bad, somebody's got to be blamed. And it fell to Walter Short, who was head of the Army at the Hawaiian Islands, who was also out by January 1942, and husband Kimmel, even though the Navy has done a number of studies and reports afterwards to completely exonerate. I have one of them here. Completely exonerate these two men. And as a matter of fact, our own government handcuffed them, because we had not yet intercepted the Japanese military code, but we had intercepted their diplomatic code. But yet the material that we were getting that was coming into the U.S. Embassy in Washington was going to the White House and was going to the War Department, but it wasn't going to Kimmel, and it wasn't going to Short or any of our other overseas commanders. But MacArthur still has the advantage, because he's been told, in every means possible, shortwave radio, telegrams, the wire services, the radio, that all these other installations have been hit, and yet he does nothing. MacArthur was a political legacy. His father won the Congressional Medal of Honor for service in the Civil War. He was a career military officer. He was a good friend of Franklin Roosevelt's. He was very good friends with Henry and Clara Booth Luce. And as a matter of fact, the week before, Clara Booth Luce had done pretty much a fawning profile of MacArthur that was on the cover of Life magazine the week before, December 7th, 1941. So he had enormous political support. He was a very popular man. So I suspect that factored a lot into it, into why MacArthur wasn't forced out in the way that Kimmel and Short were forced out. Now, in MacArthur's defense, is that he did go to Australia and did end up mounting a brilliant counteroffensive up the Australian coastline to drive all the way to Japan, and then had to stop because we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So anyway.
I have a question, Craig. How unanimous was the media, December 8th?
Oh, it was, actually, that's a great question. Because the media, nobody really questioned anything. There were little columnists here and there that might question, some of the mandates that are coming out of Washington. But there was one interesting mandate that did come out that was endorsed by the Radio Broadcast Association. And it was a directive that came from the government and the Navy and the FCC to all radio properties in America, which specifically said what they could not do. You could not broadcast rumors, ship movement, troop movement, rumor, innuendo. You couldn't use the war for commercial purposes. You couldn't say, and here's the war news brought to you by Campbell's Soup. It was big, and then the memo was very specific, which said is that the government will take your radio property and shut it down or take control for the duration of the emergency if you don't follow these strictures. So is that there was very little, almost no criticism whatsoever of the U.S. government. It's hard to believe now. I guess that the same feeling was going on after September 11th, which is that not knowing and the abject fear. But you compound that with a lack of information. Is that there were rumors of bombings in New York, Washington, Boston, Los Angeles, San Francisco. Is that they did blackout? The newspapers were printing rumors, of all this stuff. And finally, Roosevelt goes on national radio and takes it to the media and lectures them about don't print any more rumors, don't print anything that is not official fact or not official war news or not something that's either coming from the White House or from the War Department. He really lays into the media in a radio broadcast from the White House a couple days after. Which, by the way, I want to make one point too, is that as far as the media goes, is that we all think the first official pronouncement from the government or from Roosevelt or from the Roosevelt White House was December 8th, 1941, was his speech in Congress. That's not true. Eleanor Roosevelt gave the first broadcast from the position of the Roosevelt family and in many ways on the position of the national government. She had a regular radio show. Of course, she had her column My Day. And she went on national radio the night of December 7th and went and talked about, it was about morale, it was about her own 4 sons. One at that point was on a ship at sea. Eventually all 4 boys, all Roosevelt boys, went into war service and all served very honorably. And talked about people not being scared. She did have one piece of misinformation, which is interesting. Now here she is, the First Lady of the United States, and she said in that radio broadcast that is that the president was meeting at that very time when the Japanese were bombing with the Japanese ambassador, which is not true. The Japanese ambassador was meeting with Cordell Hull, who was the Secretary of State at the time. At that day, that Sunday, December 7th, FDR was meeting with a Chinese diplomat, but not a representative of Japan. And so even then, in the close proximity of the White House, is that the information is not accurate all the time.
Thank you. We have another program coming in at 6 o'clock, so we'll have to end this session here. But don't forget, both authors will be here on either side of the table below, and they will be signing books, and Michael can help you out with that. Thank you all for coming. This is the World War II